In this video, we're going to talk about negative and coterminal angles with a unit circle. The assumption is, before you've watched this video, that you've watched the video on finding the first quadrant using special right triangles and showing how all the values are calculated. The other assumption is you've watched the second video that goes from the first quadrant and then extrapolates those values all the way around the unit circle, going in the positive direction to here. I did add one extra thing, which is this mnemonic device you see here, which stands for all things are positive in this quadrant, only sine is positive in the second quadrant, only tangent is positive in the third quadrant, and only cosine is positive in the fourth quadrant. An easy way to remember that is all students take calculus, and I'll refer back to it when we look at some examples in this video. So what is a negative angle? Well, the way we need to think about this is going in this direction right here is positive, okay? And going in this direction is negative. So counterclockwise, meaning against the clock, is actually positive, and going with the clock is negative. So if I were to consider this angle right here, this is pi over 6. But if I go in the negative direction to here, this is negative pi over 6. And that actually immediately brings up the concept of coterminal. Co meaning with, terminal meaning ending. So negative pi over 6 is the same thing as 11 pi over 6. Negative 30 degrees is the same thing as 330. And the same thing is true if I keep going. So if I were to go, to here, right? If I were to go up to 45 degrees, the negative version of that would take me down to negative 45, which is coterminal with positive 315. And this negative pi over 4 value is coterminal with 7 pi over 4. And the same thing keeps going. So if I went up to the 60-degree angle here, if I went the other direction, so I went negative 60, this would be negative 60. But it's also the same thing as 300. This is pi over 3. Going this direction is negative pi over 3, but it's the same thing as 5 pi over 3, and that can be done for every angle on here. Coterminal, though, is more than just negative. So coterminal can mean going all the way around the circle more than once and landing in the same place. So if I think about this angle, this is 30 degrees. But if I go all the way around it again, another 360 degrees, this could also be said here, this little overlap where I did it again would be 30 plus 360, so 390. Same thing with the pi over 6, the radian measure. This is pi over 6, but if I go all the way around a circle is 2 pi if the radius is 1, which is what unit means for the unit circle. So pi over 6 plus 2 pi, find a common denominator, it would be pi over 6 plus 12 pi over 6, or 13 pi over 6. And in fact, if I wanted to do that, I could keep going. I could go all the way around again, right? So I could add another 360 to it, or another 2 pi to it. And this is true for any value. So if I were to go to here, let's say I went from the origin going counterclockwise in the positive direction to 120, that's 120. But if I kept going all the way around and then went around a second time, that would end up being 120 plus 360, which would be 480 degrees. And for the radian measure, the 2 pi over 3 would be 2 pi over 3 plus 2 pi. Find a common denominator. 2 pi over 3 plus 6 pi over 3 would be 8 pi over 3. And again, if you wanted to, you could keep going around. You could even go the other way. You could go in the opposite direction. So you could start here, right? And you could go to this, and then you could go all the way around again and subtract 2 pi. So there are an infinite amount of coterminal angles. Most people worry about a positive and a negative coterminal angle in terms of what you're going to look at in the future. So let's take a look at some examples here for this. So let's say I wanted to find sine of negative pi over 6. What I would do is I would say, okay, negative pi over 6 means start here and go pi over 6 in this direction. And so sine of that value is negative a half. You don't need to know all the coterminal in this case. It's not asking that, but it is coterminal with 11 pi over 6. So in terms of what would cosine of negative pi be? Well, this is an interesting one because if I start here and I go in the negative direction to here, I'm back at pi again. So negative pi and pi are the same place. So is 180 and negative 180. So what is cosine of negative pi? It's negative 1. All right, if I take a look at tangent of 150, this is when you got to start thinking about these reference points or references of pi and 2 pi, or in this case, negative 180 and 180. So tangent of 150 starts here, and 150 is shy of 180. It's shy of it by 30 degrees, so it would stop right there. So the tangent value would be root 3 over 3. If I then look at the next one, this one is bigger than negative pi, right? So it is going to be up in that third quadrant. And these negative and positive values we're talking about now, they really start to help with what is what in terms of all students take calculus. So when I look at this third quadrant, which is what this one's in, it's going to start here, and 4 pi over 3 is 1 pi over 3 beyond pi. So if I go to here, I'm at negative pi, but if I go another 1/3 pi, I end up being here. And you can see that we're clearly in the sign is positive quadrant. So this question was asking about tangent, so tangent would be negative root 3, as you can see. And the same thing goes with this one. This one right here was in quadrant 4. So in quadrant 4, only cosine can be positive, so sine would be negative. And then also, the axes, you have to just think about as points. It doesn't really help you on those. But in this one, tangent was in the second quadrant, right? So tangent is big fat T there, so we know that it's going to be positive because the T stands for tangent is positive. All right, let's take a look at the next one. So what would sine of negative 270 be? Well, if I start here, remember 270 is actually beyond 180, and in fact, it's exactly 90 degrees beyond it. So 270 is actually the same thing as 90, negative 270, which makes sense because positive 270 is here, so negative 270 would be there. And so the value for going all the way around this direction for sine would be 1. All right, the last one on these examples would be what happens if we're trying to find cosine of negative 7 pi over 4. And again, this is really going to be important about what quadrant that's in. So if I looked at the fact that this is really close to negative 8 pi over 4, that's telling me this is in quadrant 1, because 8 pi over 4 would be 2 pi. So if I start here, right, if I start at the origin and I go back, this is actually referring to going to here. And so the value for cosine at negative 7 pi over 4 is root 2 over 2. All right, so let's talk about coterminal angles. So coterminals, again, that was in quadrant 1, so you know that that would be positive. So coterminal angles work very similarly, but you have to think about subtracting. So if I think about sine of 13 pi over 6, again, I'm sort of thinking in here, okay, is this closer to 6 over 6 or 2 pi over 6? So let me explain that. If it were 6 over 6, it would be close to the value here at pi, because 6 over 6 is 1. And if this were closer to 12 pi over 6, then it would be closer to here, because that would be 2, 12 divided by 6. So this one is clearly slightly past 12 pi over 6 in the positive direction. So when I look at that, when I look at sine of 13 pi over 6, I'm going to start here. I'm going to go all the way around the unit circle. This would be 12 pi over 6, and then again, this would be 13 pi over 6. So the sine value of that is a half, shown right there. Sine is a half. All right, so let's take a look at the next concept for that. So the next thing we have is cosine of 3 pi. So each one of these axes can be thought of as a pi, and the halfway are half pi or pi over 2. So if again, it was positive 3 pi. So if I go in the positive direction here, I can literally just count 1 pi, 2 pi, 3 pi. And so once I understand that, it's asking for cosine. So cosine is negative 1. All right, so let's take a look at the next one. The next one says tangent of 660. This is where students typically go, oh my gosh, 660, what is that talking about? But when it's in degrees, it's fairly easy. Because if I take 360 and subtract it from 660, I end up with 300 degrees. Notice it is in the positive. It's a positive number, so we're going in the positive direction. So again, what I'm talking about is starting here, and I would first figure out that it's at 300. And then if I take 300 and I go all the way back around, 300 plus 360 would be 660. So the question is, okay, so what is tangent of 660? That would be negative root 3. And again, this is where it really starts to pay attention to, okay, is it negative? Is it positive? So tangent in the fourth quadrant has to be negative because only cosine is positive. All right, so tangent of 17 pi over 6, that looks like a huge number, but again, compare it to 12 pi over 6, which would be 2 pi, and that's actually only 5 pi over 6 away from where we started. So in the positive direction, if I want to go 17 pi over 6, we're going to start here, right? And this would be 12 pi over 6. So to get to 17 pi over 6, we just go 5 pi over 6 further than that, and the tangent value would be negative root 3 over 3. Oops, that's supposed to have a 3 on it. I'll fix that real quick. So the question here is, it must have gotten erased. So the question here is how do I know that how do I know if it's negative? Again, sine would be positive here. So if I'm asking for tangent, which I am here, that one would be negative. All right, so how about sine of 720? Again, huge number, but not really when you think about it, because if I'm thinking about what 720 means basically go around the unit circle twice. So if I go around this unit circle 2 times, there's 360, and then 720 would be there. The sine value would be 0. And then the last example, I sort of combined both coterminal with negative. So negative 11 pi over 4. When I think about that, I need to think about the idea that 4 over 4 would be negative pi. 8 over 4 would be negative 2 pi. So this would basically be going in the negative direction, stop at 3 pi over 4. So let's see what that looks like. Going in the negative direction, I would be going this way. This would be negative 4 over 4. This would be negative 8 over 4. And then to go 3/4 more than that, I would actually end up right here at 5 pi over 4, giving me my value. So you can see right there that I would have cosine would be negative root 2 over 2. And if you're concerned about is it negative, look at it. Tangent's going to be positive, so cosine, of course, would be negative. I hope this was helpful. I hope you learned some things about rotations and about coterminal angles, and I appreciate you watching the video.